Welcome to another episode of the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. Glad to have you along. We're handling questions from you, our listeners, in this episode. And if you have them, again, comments, questions, please send them to us. We are glad to get them. questions.dcwp@gmail.com is the address. Mike will keep that email list short, or put it into a spreadsheet. He sends it to me. We think about it together, and that really forms the podcast. So today we're going to jump right back into questions. Let me say, going in, Mike, this often happens. I'm sure you do it too, where you're listening to another podcast. For example, I did this week, and it's a denominational podcast, basically, where two men are talking about their understanding of their own historic tradition and how it works. It's very well done. Doesn't matter which one it is, because what I'm going to say really could apply to any of these podcasts that are theological in nature, especially coming from a theological position, such as Reformed, Orthodox, Catholic, whatever. I often wonder to myself as I'm listening, am I listening to two guys just talk, or am I listening to what I have to believe if I'm going to become X, if I'm going to become whatever that tradition is? You see where I'm going with this? I wonder sometimes if people listen to this podcast and say, do I have to believe Ron? Do I have to believe Mike in order to have a divine counsel worldview in my head? And I would say, based on listening to other podcasts and that kind of question coming to me, I would say it this way. What you're listening to is two guys, in this sense, Ron and Mike, who have a DCW. They have a divine counsel worldview. It's the lens by which they see Scripture. That does not mean Mike and Ron always agree, and it does not even mean that you have to agree with Mike and Ron to still have a DCW. Does that make sense? So as I listen to a podcast, to use my example then, of these two guys talking about a denominational way of looking at life, I often say to myself, I like that. I like that. I don't like that. Thank you. As I turn off the podcast and go on to something else, I'm blessed by it, but I'm not necessarily thinking in terms of I have to believe them in order to become a certain tradition. I just bring that up as we start again another podcast, that I hope our listeners feel the freedom to listen to us, agree and disagree, as they even read Dr. Mike's materials, again, that starts this whole conversation that we've honored over the years, that a divine counsel or a Deuteronomy 32 worldview does not demand a list of things to believe. It does present a way of thinking that is usually consistent. And you could say that then about a Reformed person, a Catholic person, an Orthodox person, a Baptist, that there's a way of thinking. It's hard to put a circle around it, but it's a way of thinking that, generally speaking, if you believe this, then we're going to call you a this, right? And that's where, even as we go through questions again today, I'm reminded as I look at my answers, a person doesn't have to believe it, but this is where two guys, or at least in my case, me, I've come on something and I pose it to you, Mike, and you respond. By the time we're done, we have defined not what a divine counsel worldview says about something, but how two guys talking in those terms can sound. So just a quick reminder how it feels for me, and I'm sure how it feels for you. Mm-hmm. As we jump in fact, this question, let's go to the first question. It's really on the tail end of a previous question that we had, if you're listening to these in order, the end of our last podcast, where a person was talking with their pastor in a Q&A session, and the pastor asked about payment for sin, and I gave my extended answer. Part of that same question ended with this: along with the paying for sin question comes the logic of hell as Protestants understand it. It makes sense that the great evil in the world must ultimately face God's justice. Think of Hitler, Stalin, that kind of thing. Think of a mass shooting at a school. Something that's just deplorable, right? Really heinous. What do you do with that? Here's the question. If God's justice wasn't satisfied at the cross, it must be satisfied at some point, correct? Give you my thoughts, Mike, and then shoot yours back to me. Here's my thought. The idea that God must punish sin to remain just historically became prominent during the medieval period. Anselm of Canterbury, the famous book he wrote, Cur Deus Homo, Why Did God Become Man?, argued that God's honor is violated by sin, that his honor must be satisfied, and that punishment or payment is therefore necessary. And notice again the era in which he's writing, the medieval period. So my thought is, when I read that, this framework owes more to feudal honor culture, what he knew, and Roman legal theory that was coming out of the first centuries AD, than to the Bible. Okay, so that God must punish sin. I think, as I trace history backwards, the first time I really hear that is in the medieval period. I don't hear that in the Bible. Thomas Aquinas, he's medieval as well. He refined the idea. Here's what happens going forward. He refines the idea philosophically, and others followed suit, eventually entrenching the idea into what we call Western systematic theology. So when I went to Dallas Seminary, I sat under a Thomist, Norman Geisler. He knew Thomas extremely well. And I didn't know it at the time because I'm a student, but what I was getting was a Thomistic understanding of systematic theology, which wasn't really Baptist, it wasn't really Presbyterian, it wasn't, that hadn't been developed yet. This is all before the Reformation. So what made Geisler so instrumental in my own theological systematizing is that he was giving me a theology as he understood it pre-Reformation. Yeah. It included, therefore, Reformation ideas that Calvin would later jump onto and grab, whatever. But he didn't care because he was speaking Thomistically to the class, and it was just a different way of doing it. So that's my call on it, that when you come to the God must punish sin, I'm sensing as I look at it from both historically, philosophically, it's really a Thomas thing, an Aquinas idea that he got from Anselm, and that's why we think the way we do, that eternal conscious torment as a philosophical concept to repay for sin makes sense to us because we have been fed that idea through not just our psyche, but through a systematized version of theology that comes, for 1,000 years.
Well, and I would point out, and this goes back to I think 2 or 3 episodes ago, or we were just shooting the breeze at the beginning of the podcast as I just kind of shared my thoughts about my angst at times when certain denominational groups or camps make one model of atonement the be all end all of not just whether you're in the denomination, but that you're just a Christian or not. And a lot of that, I just wonder, because here you're pointing out in this one slide, Anselm is using a very well experienced model of living as an analog to try to describe what he was reading and seeing in the scriptures. Right. He was using something that the common folk would understand immediately because they experienced it in their own lives. I work under a feudal lord. If I don't output the amount of grain that I promised that I would give to this feudal lord, I will get punished because I have a debt that I owe, because I owe him, because I don't own this land. I am simply renting it. I am working it for him, and I need to pay him back for it. Right? It's experienced. It's felt. They see their neighbors who don't meet their quotas. They get into a lot of trouble. And so, of course, Anselm, in trying to communicate truths, and we do this all the time as a preacher. For me, we reach for modern day experiences to try to be a bridge to help people understand what we are reading in the scriptures.
Fair enough.
The problem is when the problem comes when we codify those as eternal metaphors or principles on equal weight with the scripture. Right. And that they can never then forever be changed or modified or just even abandoned because maybe this model doesn't work anymore. And so that's where I have my kind of gripes at times of, I see folks who get very worked up about penal substitutionary atonement, and I understand why, because of the characters and how in some camps it has devolved into essentially this very guilt-ridden, shame-ridden type of system that's described. Mm-hmm. And that I don't see that within the scripture.
Yeah.
So I see the reaction, but at the same time, it's I guess I just don't think it is worth that much energy and time to try to make something out of atonement that even the early church, when they had the chance to give us some sense of where they were thinking,
Right.
they didn't feel the need because they saw all the kaleidoscopic version of like, there's so many different metaphors, so many different allusions, allegories, or analogies that are being used to describe what happened
When Jesus died. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they never felt that was something they had to address because it was more important to like, let's make sure we know who Jesus really was. He was not a ghost.
Now,
He was a human being, but at the same time, he seemed to be creator. What is going on here? Like they focused more on that instead of, what's going on with the cross? Let's just only have one way of thinking about it. No, because they saw in the New Testament description, there were so many ways that the New Testament writers described it.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
why make it monolithic when it wasn't monolithic in the scriptures?
Yeah. Let's turn the question, as the questioner did, to the logic of hell then. Yeah. I continue my thoughts about that. It is fair to ask whether the idea of eternal conscious torment is a logical necessity within the character of God, outside the question of whether it's taught in the Bible. Let me, again, be careful with how I say that. Because remember, the questioner's thought was, what about evil in the world and letting it go? Can God let it go, or does he demand justice in the next world, shall we say, in the concept of hell? And I'm saying, let's start by realizing it's fair to ask two separate questions. Is eternal conscious torment a logical necessity within the character of God? And secondly, is it taught in the Bible that way? So I want to clarify, you can ask two separate questions. We can then turn ourselves, or here's the third point, we can then turn to ourselves and ask the same question. Is eternal punishment logically necessary within the human psyche? When I watch the news and I hear of a terrible, deplorable thing that someone does, my wife often even doesn't want to see it. She silences the clicker, I can't hear it because it's going through something really bad. Even like the Epstein files, whenever that comes up on the news, my wife mutes because she doesn't want to hear it. And I understand why. There's people who are suffering today because of evil, right? Now, human psyche says, how could Epstein get away with it? How can he just commit suicide and not have to deal with what he did, right? So that's a third question. Is eternal punishment logically necessary within the human psyche, or is it a culturally driven idea that we cling to out of hope for retribution? Here's where the atheist is, right? The atheist would believe that Epstein, to use our modern day example, did get off the hook. He simply killed himself. And so he now, whatever he did, he never had to pay for because he simply, in one moment of time, stopped living. We as Christians, I think, or even as theists, we say, oh, how can that be? Where a man can do evil and then just kill themselves and get away with it. So there is that other question that I'm adding to the pot, and that is there something within the human psyche, possibly that's driving us toward a mild, at least, theism, that believes a person has to pay for what they do? I mean, come on. You can't get away with egregious evil like the atheist would maintain. You have to pay in the next life for that. So I'm just offering these as possibilities. I do then recommend, as a next question or kind of a jumping off point into the next, even to answer my own questions, consider C.S. Lewis's point in Mere Christianity, Book 3, Chapter 5. One of those lines that has reverberated in my head for years. Everyone says forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have something to forgive. In other words, forgiveness is wonderful. No, it isn't. Because if you're asking me to forgive that person for what they did, I can't do it, right? That's how we think. Could it be that forgiveness itself is that difficult, that you are asked by God, or in the Matthew 18 parable, the king tells his servant that he forgave to turn around and be that forgiving to his debtor? The shock value of that story at the end of Matthew 18 is that if forgiveness is a real thing, it is an amazing thing. It's a bizarre idea that I would actually forgive a person their debts to me when I could hold it over their head, right? So I'm just asking various ways of, or I'm thinking through various ways of pondering this really good question. Is eternal conscious torment, i.e. hell, a logical necessity? Well, you got several options here. Is it within the character of God necessary? Is it taught in the Bible necessary? Is it culturally necessary? Is it human psychologically necessary? And I think all of those questions, as deep as they go, again, too far for our purposes here, have to be at least pondered in the answer of that question. How about I give you my final thought, Mike, and then let you let go of what you're storing up, I'm sure, in your head. I would recommend that the question, how can God forgive sin and still be just, is never pondered. So, this logical necessity question of does God need to get payment? I think when I look at the Bible in context, I am at a loss for finding any biblical author asking that question in context. How can God forgive sin and still be just? I know people have their pet verses for that, but I think they're all taken out of context to some degree. On the other hand, this is, I think, something we have to always remember. God's righteousness, justice, same word in Hebrew and Greek, and grace are often found side by side. I could multiply 24 passages right there on the screen for people to look at where justice and forgiveness are in the same verse, side by side in the character of God. So they are not competing ideas. The more prominent question, and here we get to a divine counsel worldview, here's where I think the answer or the lens by which a divine counsel worldview looks at the Bible does have a response. Now, whether it's something, a person can agree with, I don't know, but here's my thought on this. The question that the Bible is asking is, quote, how does God restore creation and reclaim the authority he had originally allotted to created gods while remaining faithful to his original covenant in extending the inheritance of the family of Abraham to everyone in the world? That, to me, is the question that the entire Bible is trying to answer, starting in Genesis 12 and moving to Revelation 21 or 22. And that question, notice how the reason I read it that way and put the whole thing there is because notice that in that question is never asked, how can God be just and forgiving at the same time? That would be a sub question that may get into a conversation within the bigger question. But if you're asking the biblical question of what's going on here, to me, that's what's going on. And the question of can God forgive sin or does he need payment in hell is a side question that the Bible, I don't think, unless I'm missing something, ever ponders in context. I've said a lot, I know, so if there's anything there you want to jump on.
I think there's ways to approach this is justice is something that I think is just the biblical writers, they never questioned it of how can God forgive sin and still be just, because to them, God is just. There is not a question if.
Right.
It's just that he is. And so that's not the question. How can God forgive sin? That may be a question in what's the mechanics? What's the pathway of how that could happen? But whether he's going to stay just or not.
Well, as soon as you get into mechanics, to me, you don't get forgiveness. It's either mechanics or forgiveness. You can't have, if my son breaks my window and I say, son, that's going to be $20 and then I'll forgive you. My son never gets forgiven. He pays. If the neighbor kid breaks my window and I say, it's okay. Now that's forgiveness. I didn't demand payment. So see the difference there is if we talk in payment terms and then we talk about God's forgiveness through that payment. I'm saying, well, wait. You either get forgiven or pay. I mean, you can't go both ways, and yet often I hear them being combined. So.
I mean, I think earlier when you had the slide about using Epstein, for example, as the sort of the more modern example of like how can a person like what he had done, what he had been responsible of, that whole entire network, how could he, in some sense, get away with it?
Right.
And I think there is something that is there, because I think there is something about the value of being made in the image of God, as the image of God, that there is an inherent that was wrong. And that is an echo of, in some sense, of our origin as well, from the same creator who is just. So we are echoing something that he himself would also probably
good
say
point.
Right too.
It should bother
think,
us that someone can get away with evil. Yeah, that should bother us.
And so I think that there is something that is there, because I think some people, some folks, some camps would just simply just say it's all forgiveness and brush it to the side. And at the same time, they unintendedly diminish the pain and in some sense, the horror of things that had been done, right? In just sweeping it under the concept of, well, everyone gets forgiven, everyone gets to go to heaven. There is nothing that will ever, no one will care. And that, unfortunately, you then dismiss the actual present and even past pain as saying it's meaningless. And I think that's a practical theological pathway I cannot go down, because
and I don't think anybody wants to go down that path. That's a painful path to think about, that we would just say God doesn't care, and it's just
and that it's meaningless. So I think that's why we have to kind of be careful how we approach this. This is a really big question, and I think one of the, at least what I would go back to, is the concepts of how the first, second, third century church fathers think through this, because they were dealing with these kind of things. They themselves were going through persecutions, martyrdoms, injustice enacted especially against them, because they were just simply following Christ as Lord and not Caesar. and so you get to this interesting thing of, is it eternal, or are they simply just gone from existence? And that ultimately,
where is justice in that? Yeah.
And I think ultimately there is something of, of the pathways that they thought through, is something that maybe we ought to take times to look back on, because I don't understand what it means to live through 3-4 generations where you as a Christian just know you're going to be a second-class citizen. You're going to be mistreated. You're going to be maligned. You're going to always have the threat of being martyred or killed on the streets just because you say Jesus is Lord. I don't understand that experience. And I don't understand the experience of even current day many Eastern Christians who live under countries and regimes where they are literally treated as second-class citizens, where they have a poll tax that is on them for simply not being the preferred follower of faith, where they had to endure, where their own leaders are essentially in multi-generational debt because they're paying for those taxes so that their people don't feel the financial pressure to convert to the preferred religion. I don't understand that. And so I think when we deal with these kind of questions, this a little bit is a part of a mystery for me, of how will God actually reckon with this ultimately? Because faithful brothers and sisters, there is a sense of this is unjust. And I follow a God who is just.
Thank you. And as we close the question, it really reminds me that once again, as you put Jesus into the story, and notice how at the end of my own rendition of what the biblical story is all about, I would say, now enter Jesus. And everyone has Jesus enter the story as they understand it, in order to solve the problem that had been growing, developing before he came. And my version, I recommend again a DCW version even for me, is that what Jesus comes to solve is the very question that I had posed. How does God restore creation? Reclaiming the authority he had originally allotted to created gods, while remaining faithful to his original covenant and extending the inheritance of Abraham to everyone else in the world. Enter Jesus. See, he is the answer to that question. And as I pose that again to my Reformed friends, as I'm sure this questioner had with her pastor, the pastor had a different question in his head that needed to be solved, usually the payment for sin question. So I'm just saying this as we close this question. Everyone has Jesus being the answer, but you expose your answer, or you expose the question you had by explaining what Jesus did, right? You're showing by the solution of Jesus what the question even was. And to me, Jesus answers this question in his teaching, in his death, in his resurrection, and in the apostles' preaching about him, better than any other model that I'm aware of. So, great question. Thank you for it. My goodness, did we answer it? I don't know, Mike. If God's justice wasn't satisfied at the cross, it must be satisfied at some point, correct? And my answer back is, I don't know if we want to talk about payment again, because if that's what forgiveness is all about, man, forgiveness is going to be the topic of conversation in heaven someday, in the next age. We're going to talk about this idea, how God could forgive. And I think I'm going to have to wait until that side of heaven to hear God out on this, because right now, that's kind of what we're saying, isn't it? Back and forth. The human psyche just cannot handle the idea that a person can get away with abject evil. It just doesn't sound right. It doesn't feel right. It hurts. We see too much suffering from people who are hurt by others to just disallow or just kind of dismantle the question and let it go. So I want to honor the sufferer, but I also want to posit the reality of forgiveness is a fascinatingly deep idea. So,
and this roots back to Second Temple materials, where in the book of First Enoch, that was one of the narrative points, is that Enoch.
It is, yeah.
The Watchers
and Maccabees especially, yeah. How can the evil that's coming upon our nation now not be vindicated by God? Well, that was a huge question back then.
And I think still is in many ways, in ways that we don't realize, that it is still something. I mean, like, for example, the more ancient example for like Gen Zers and Gen Alpha, Hitler. He purposely went through a process of making sure, because he saw what happened to his ally Mussolini, that he made sure that when he unlifed himself, there would be nothing left for anyone or anything to do something to his remains.
Right.
And it was purposeful. It was to essentially spite everyone that were against him, so that there would be nothing that they could do. And there is, in some sense, a loss of closure, a lack of a sense of justice, because what in the world? And I think in some sense that ironically, unfortunately, has made him in some sense still infamously immortal, because there was not really that sense of closure. Instead, we're still now looking for, even outrightly using his name as an insult on people we don't like. But in some sense, I think that's because we never had full closure with the horror that happened back in that time.
Lee Harvey Oswald, his grave is unmarked. Why? Because it's just that sense of we don't want to even honor him with knowing where he is. It's one of those sideline stories again, that just because we just have a sense of justice in mind, which I think is a huge psychological reality. Well, thank you for the question. I'm sorry if I didn't answer straightforwardly. I'm befuddled by the question, frankly, and I don't know what more to say. Let's try one more for our time today. Interesting again, Jesus' loyalty to the Father as polemic. Here's how the question came. Could Jesus' teaching regarding loyalty to his Father, this is all through John as our Bible study has been going on, I do only his will. John 8:29, I only do the things that please him. Amazing statement. Could Jesus' teaching regarding loyalty to his Father be understood as a polemic against Israel's loyalty to created gods, especially Baal. In this sense, could Jesus' explanation of his loyalty to the Father also be a polemic against the rebellious God's relationship to Yahweh? If you're diagramming this, you'd see, Yahweh at the top, created gods below him, humans on the ground, and then Jesus off to the side. And you have 4 sets of beings here who are relating to each other in some sense. Jesus saying to the crowd in front of him, I'm always loyal to, and the arrow would go up to Yahweh. And then Jesus saying in so many ways, and we've seen this in John, where he turns to his followers and they claim to have the line going up to Yahweh, and he's claiming, no, your line is, John 8:44, your father is the devil. You actually are worshiping a different deity. So fun to draw that out for the audience, which we're not going to do. But let me say, as an answer, here's what I would do. A DCW assumes that a Deuteronomy 32 worldview was understood by ancient Israel and by those, here's the point, who heard Jesus. So nothing new here, but I'm saying that when you think in terms of what Jesus' hearers heard Jesus say, always remember that a DCW model is recommending that what you get in Deuteronomy 32 about the allotment of gods to the nations, that would have been both understood by ancient Israel, by Moses, by David, all the Old Testament characters, Daniel included, and by the Maccabeans, and by Jesus' audience. Don't separate the Old Testament and the New Testament into 2 separate worlds. You have that same worldview seeping through the story so that you come into even Paul's day, in some sense, the world is still under the prince and the power of the air. Now that, and there's maybe some trajectory changes where the nations of the Old Testament now turn into the heir of the Roman Empire in Paul's mind, but he still sees created deities as being, the gods of the nations in some sense. So that's all I'm saying with that first point, is that yes, we do have a worldview that's consistent into the life of Jesus. Now, that being said, listening to Jesus talk about his loyalty to the Father must have been interpreted, and here's where I like the question, in clear distinction to how many Jews had become disloyal to Yahweh. That point is often missed. We often hear it. I just heard a sermon, I don't know where it was, where they painted the picture of the Pharisees, Jesus' enemies, as just having bad days. They're godly men, but boy, are they're hypocritical in their godliness. I would say no. Jesus is trying to say in the text, you're not even Yahwists. You claim to worship the God of Israel, and lo and behold, you are connected to a demon or the devil himself. And that's a clear statement thus of which God you worship. So, yes, I think Jesus' statements about loyalty to the Father would have been heard in contradistinction to the Pharisees' loyalty to other gods, something like that. And I like the second part of that. I hadn't thought of this until the question came. And the gods of the nations, what they had done. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, on our little diagram in our heads, we have God, gods, Pharisees, and Jesus. Now you have Jesus' polemic about his being loyal to the Father as also a statement said in front of the gods about their disloyalty to Yahweh. I like that. I had thought of that connection, but if Satan or the demons had been listening to Jesus, they would have realized Jesus is doing what we should have done all along. What is it, Psalm 89? Worship, or Psalm 97. Worship him, all you Elohim. Even the psalmist is chiding the gods of the nations that they need to be loyal to Yahweh, and they're not. And so I like the question for how it's thinking through all the ramifications, the polemic of Jesus' teaching and how it would have struck his original hearers.
Ron, can I share with you like a story that connects right to that second point? Mm-hmm. It was during my first year in my cohort for my doctorate right now. And we had a guest scholar who was basically teaching us, I'm doing a doctorate in preaching. And this is one of the cool things I realized about the doctorate as I've been going through it, is that it has allowed me to touch upon biblical studies, systematic theology, practical theology, because all of that, when you're in preaching, you have to do all three. And so I keep touching those worlds and I love it. And one of the interesting things was we talked about Genesis 6 in one of the cohort sessions. And the scholar admitted he knows about how people take Genesis 6 as divine beings and whatnot, and not the line of, Cain and the line of Abel type thing. He is more of the latter, but he understands where people who think these are divine beings, watchers and stuff like that, you can go with that too. He understands that as an actual valid theological perspective. And the challenge was, can you preach that Old Testament text and somehow connect it eventually to the New Testament presentation of Jesus?
Right.
And so ultimately, my homiletical big idea was that unlike the sons of God who rebelled against the Creator, Jesus, who is the Son of God, ultimately showed what loyalty to the Creator looked like.
Yeah, that would have fit right in here. Yeah.
And the brilliance of, just like as we were going into it, is just like, how do you bring the entire canon of Scripture into your main idea for your sermon? And you just drive that home. And yeah, it was a really cool moment for me of being able to see, like, Jesus really did actually show to the sons, all these other rebellious sons of God, what loyalty does look like. What does it mean to actually be loyal to the Creator? And he lived that out as ironically as a human being. It showed what that really looked like on a very down-to-earth, literally down-to-earth practice.
And that's why the faithfulness of Jesus, remember that Pistis Christou question that's being bantered about, at least in the last 20 years, among biblical theologians. The King James often has faith in Jesus, and modern interpreters like N.T. Wright would recommend that the word is genitive. It's the faithfulness of Jesus. And then about 5 or 6 times in the New Testament, you have that question. Are we talking about having faith in Jesus, or are we talking about having something said about the faithfulness of Jesus? To me, that gets right into this, that what Jesus is doing is showing either to the Pharisees or to the gods themselves, here's what faithfulness looks like. Here's what you thought it was ritual. You thought it was whatever. I'm going to show you what faithfulness looks like. And it's a call back to the very soul of man, what it means to be in the image of God, that you don't have to go through a field and wash your hands before you pluck grain. There's your faithfulness. You can do this or not do this, whatever, and you can be faithful in ways. And here comes, again, the life of Jesus. If we could watch the video, I think we'd be amazed at the normalcy of his life in some ways, and yet the distinctiveness of his life compared to others that called themselves Yahwists, and he knew that that's not what it was all about. So this loyalty to the Father as a polemic question, I think, is well said, and it catches something for me that it's like gears that were spinning and not connecting. And ever since I thought of the question in the last couple of weeks, those gears have come together. And let me complain to the questioner. Thanks a lot. Now my mind is going down a path that I just don't have time to go down for other reasons. But no, thank you in all honesty for the question, because I think you could develop this into a dissertation, frankly, if you had the time. So I think one more thing to say. Yeah, one more thing I'm going to say on this, and I think we'll call it. And how many have we done? 2 questions? I think this is our second question, right?
Yeah.
For this podcast. Let me read this and then get your opinion. It is also interesting that Jesus repeatedly grounds his authority, both in this world and the next, in his obedience and faithfulness to the Father. It is surprising, as I even look through John that we've been studying, how often he does this. His authority is rarely, I think it is to some degree, but it's rarely argued ontologically, such as in, I have authority because I'm divine, just who I am. More often, you're going to hear on the daily conversations that Jesus has in the Gospels, for example, a vocational and relational argument. I have authority because I am, now listen to him say things like, I'm loved by my Father. I do all those things that please him. There's this constant appeal to his own faithfulness as a reason for the placement of his authority both in this world and the next. And the Philippian Christ hymn, we call it, in Philippians 2, 5 through 11, he again, it's a hymn, so I take it to be some symbolic language thrown in that's not meant to be taken theologically strict sometimes, as we do the kenosis language or the kenotic language of giving up, letting go. He gave up the form of God so that he could become man, the form of man, and then even a servant who dies a death on a cross. Remember that down, down, down analogy of the hymn. Mm-hmm. Therefore, God has exalted him to the right hand so that God may be glorified through this. So even that hymn, as symbolic or metaphorical as it might sound at some point, it's real, it's true, but notice the story is the faithfulness of Jesus even to death is what gets the therefore. Diakai. Therefore, God has highly exalted him to the position. And so, if anything, that hymn that the early Christians sang celebrated not the ontologicalness of Jesus, who he was at creation, as much as this person was faithful unto death, and therefore that is why we now serve him as our pinnacle of faith ourselves. Even as we're left on earth serving a God in heaven, we do so with the understanding of his faithfulness being our model as well. So I think there's a lot of, even as the question's asked, I think there's a lot of theology that starts to bleed out of this question of faithfulness of Jesus and the polemical nature of how it struck his first audience. Not only the Pharisees, not only the gods, but even Paul and the Philippians living 1,000 miles away in Philippi are now taking this faithfulness of Jesus as, wow, this is something I can do. This is something he did. This is something that I follow in his footsteps. Even theosis, the question of becoming part of the divine nature, I think is going to be placed into this concept of walking in the footsteps of a faithful Jesus. So much going on in that question. Thank you for it. And may I joke, thanks a lot. Thanks for all that now I got to think about. But that's how theology works. Someone flips a switch in your head and now you got a month of thinking to do.
I think this is just, again, it just shows that it's not a simple one-to-one, but it's a web of different connections, because I think this exposes in some sense maybe even our Western bias at times, where we think of submission as though that means that you are somehow worth less.
Oh, yeah. Good point.
And I think the reality is submission is the way that even the Creator had done things, because Paul later in his other letters, like in Colossians, he would mention that we live and breathe through him. And yet that's the irony, is that the nature of our Creator appears to be very much at times, and I'm not just talking about Jesus, I'm talking about just all three of them as one, 3 in 1, but that the nature seems to be out of service, right? Because we can't breathe on our own. It has to come from them. We cannot exist on our own. It has to come from them. And even the way that they relate to one another ultimately is in service of each other. Jesus glorifies the Father, yet the Father will glorify the Son. The Spirit will point to the Son and the Father. The Spirit enables us to worship the Father and the Son. Like there's this sense of service that's happening because they are the very end being source of all things. All of our energy, all of our thought, all of our ability to do anything, think anything, breathe anything ultimately comes from that source, from this Creator.
Yeah, in fact, as we close, go ahead.
And it just seems to be out of a innate desire to serve. That service is to actually, like, out of a place of love and joy, not out of begrudgingness.
And I'll be honest, as we close our podcast this time, that I struggle with this still. This is something now I'm getting into my older age, I still find myself surprised at my inability, and I say this hopefully humbly, no, this is proud, that's the point. I'm amazed at my own inability to be a servant. Because you say it's like Lewis about the forgiveness thing. It's nice to talk about being a servant until you have to be one. And I just grind away in my head of, why do I got to do this? And I won't get into specifics, but that's one of my battles. And I close with this because I found it in The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis. And it speaks to this. And as to God, we must remember that the soul is but a hollow which God fills. Its union with God is, almost by definition, a continual self-abandonment, an opening, an unveiling, a surrender of itself. A blessed spirit is a mold, ever more and more patient of the bright metal poured into it, a body ever more completely uncovered to the meridian blaze of the spiritual sun. Oof. And that picture of a mold being poured, the bright metal being of God being poured into me as a mold is a comforting thought. And I know we all suffer. We all could explain a long list of things that we go through, and I too. Let's think of ourselves as Jesus would say, as a faithful one who is, even in his life, I think that he would have seen himself as a mold into which God's bright metal was being poured, and we the same. So there is positive outcome, absolutely. But boy, while you're going through it, it's not easy. And so that's why Jesus' loyalty to the Father is a beautiful, not just polemic, but it's a beautiful teaching. So, well, with that, let's call it again a day. Thank you so much, Mike. Appreciate the ability to drop things on you on a dime's notice and hear your thoughts. I enjoy them, and we will continue this. We got that inbox that we're clearing out. Keep them coming to the questions again, or the emails would go to, for questions, would go to questions.dcwp@gmail.com. Until we talk again next week, I trust you all will have a blessed week.